the 24th of February 1944. In the jungle hills east of the Mayu Range, in the coastal strip of Burma that the British called the Arakan, a Japanese colonel named Tanahashi is about to do something that the code of his army treated as close to unthinkable. He is going to order a retreat that no one above him has approved. His regiment, the 112th Infantry, had gone into this operation 2,190 strong. Around 400 men can still stand and fight. They are out of rice. They are almost out of ammunition. For nearly 3 weeks, they have flung themselves at a single square of scrub and paddy in the jungle that they were promised would fall in a matter of days. And it has not fallen. It has not even bent. Tanahashi sends a message to his divisional commander that has survived in his own words. He says that he regrets it, but that he is determined to do it. He says there is no alternative. Sit with that for a moment, because the man sending that message is neither a fool nor a coward. He is a professional soldier from an army that had spent 2 years teaching the British and the Indians and the Americans a single, brutal lesson across the whole of Southeast Asia. The lesson was this: cut a Western army off from its supplies, and it breaks. Get behind it, and it panics. Surround it, and it runs. That lesson had held at Singapore. It had held in the first Arakan campaign. It had held so many times that it had stopped being a tactic and started to feel like a law of nature. And here, in a dusty clearing, the British called the admin box, the law had simply stopped working. A garrison, made up mostly of clerks, cooks, drivers, mule handlers and storemen, had been surrounded, had been cut off, had watched their own headquarters overrun in the dark, and had refused to break. The failure of Tanahashi's regiment leaves behind the single most important question of the entire Burma campaign, and it is a plain one. Why did they not run? Hold on to that question, because this is not really a story about a supply dump in the jungle. This is a story about how an army that had lost almost everything taught itself, at last, to stand still. This is the story of the Battle of the Admin Box. To understand why the Japanese could not account for the thing in front of them, you first have to understand what their army believed, and why they had every reason to believe it. And to understand that, you have to go back, not to the start of this battle, but to the humiliation that came before it. The Arakan is a strip of coastal Burma, known today as Rakhine, wedged between the Bay of Bengal and a spine of jungle mountains called the Mayu Range. It is a country of tidal creeks, mangrove-flooded paddy, and steep hills smothered in bamboo. In the cold weather of 1942 to 1943, the British had tried to push down this strip toward the port and airfield of Ngakyedauk, and the result had been a disaster that left a deep mark on the whole of the Indian Army. British and Indian battalions were thrown again and again at fortified Japanese bunkers around a village called Donbaik. The bunkers were low, dug deep, and sited to cover one another, so well built that shellfire barely troubled them. Frontal attack after frontal attack went in and died. Then, in the manner that had become the enemy's trademark, a Japanese force worked around the open flank, got into the rear, and the whole offensive folded and streamed back toward India. The cost was thousands of casualties, but the deeper cost was in the mind. The British soldier came out of the first Arakan half believing that the Japanese were something more than human in the jungle, silent, tireless, always somehow behind you. General Wavell, the commander-in-chief in India, admitted afterwards that part of the army had been handed a task beyond its training. The men who had actually been there put it more simply. They had been beaten, they knew it, and they did not know how to stop it happening all over again. The Japanese, for their part, had drawn the opposite lesson, and it filled them with a confidence that shaded into contempt. Their method was elegant, and it was proven. You did not batter your way through a defensive line. You slipped around it, on foot, through country the enemy had written off as impassable. You planted a roadblock behind him, astride the line that fed him. Then you waited. The enemy, suddenly finding the Japanese in his rear, would turn to fight his way back out. His nerve would fail. His formations would come apart into a fighting retreat, and a fighting retreat, once it is chased, curdles into a rout. It had worked in Malaya. It had worked in the long retreat that drove the British out of Burma in 1942. It had worked in the first Arakan. 3 moving parts: infiltrate, encircle, collapse. Inside its own logic, the doctrine was very nearly perfect. There was, however, a single hidden assumption buried inside it, and the whole battle would turn on that assumption. The Japanese method of cutting a British force off from its supplies only worked if being cut off actually destroyed the force. It took for granted that a surrounded army was a starving army, and that a starving army was already a beaten one, for as long as anyone could remember, that had simply been true, because there was no way for it to be otherwise. An army on the ground was fed from the ground along roads and tracks and railway lines. Cut the road, and you cut the food. Cut the food, and within a week, the thing was decided. The Japanese had built a war-winning method on top of a fact about geography that every soldier in the world took for granted. Every soldier, that is, except the man quietly rebuilding the beaten British army in India, who had come to the conclusion that the old fact was no longer true. His name was William Slim, and to understand him, you have to grasp that he neither looked nor sounded like the saviour of an empire's eastern front. He had not risen through the fashionable regiments or the great military families. He had been brought up in Birmingham, worked as a school teacher in a poor part of the city and then as a clerk in a metal firm, and had slipped into the army in 1914 through a side door, joining a university officer training corps he was not strictly entitled to join. He was wounded at Gallipoli and wounded again in Mesopotamia. He was heavy-jawed, blunt, and he spoke to ordinary soldiers as if he were one of them, which, in a general, they found almost suspicious until they decided it was real. The men of what became the 14th Army took to calling him Uncle Bill, and they meant it with affection, which is not a thing soldiers usually feel about the man who decides where they will die. Slim took command of the newly formed 14th Army in October 1943, and he inherited an army that had been beaten and knew it too well. What he did with it over the following months is one of the great feats of military repair in the whole war, and almost none of it was glamorous. He waged war on malaria and dysentery with an iron discipline about mosquito nets, clean water and drugs, because he understood that in Burma sickness killed far more men than the enemy ever did. He retrained his divisions in the jungle patiently, until the jungle stopped being the enemy's ally and started to become theirs. He pushed patrols out at night to dominate the ground between the lines, so that the legend of the invincible Japanese infiltrator began to rot quietly from the edges inward. He rebuilt the confidence of his men in 3 layers, in what they were fighting for, in the competence of the men leading them, and in the plain material things, the food and the mail and the medicine, that told a soldier his army had not forgotten him. And when critics grumbled that his careful set-piece attacks were like using a steam hammer to crack a walnut, Slim was untroubled. "If you have a steam hammer handy," he replied in effect, "and you do not much mind what is left of the walnut, it is not a bad way to crack it." Above all, he attacked, inside his own mind, the one idea that had lost every previous campaign in this theatre, the idea that to be surrounded was to be finished. His answer to it was so simple that it sounds almost naive, right up until the moment you watch it work. He told his commanders that when the Japanese got behind them and cut the road, they were not to wheel about and fight their way back to safety. They were to stay exactly where they were. They were to form a defended position, all round, with the guns in the centre, and they were to hold it. And they would not starve because they would no longer be fed along the severed road at all. They would be fed from the air. A surrounded force, Slim insisted, should think of the Japanese and not of itself, as the side that was truly surrounded. It is one of those lines that is easy to deliver in a lecture room, and almost impossible to believe when there are mortar bombs walking out of the darkness toward you, and a voice in the trees is calling to you in your own language. But it was the hinge on which everything turned. If a cut-off force could be supplied from above, then cutting the road no longer won the battle. And if cutting the road no longer won the battle, then the entire Japanese method, the whole beautiful machine of infiltration and encirclement and collapse, was pointed at a target that had quietly stood up and walked away. Slim did not conjure air supply out of nothing, and it is only fair to say so. Aircraft had dropped stores to troops before. The long-range Chindit columns had already been kept alive from the air, deep behind Japanese lines during their first expedition into Burma in 1943. What Slim did was take a daring improvisation and forge it into doctrine, a standing answer that an ordinary division could count on, so that a soldier in a slit trench with the enemy at his back could believe, truly believe, that the parachutes would come. And belief of that kind cannot be issued as an order. It has to be earned, once in the open, in front of the whole army. Somebody had to be surrounded, cut off, fed from the sky, and live, before the rest would trust their lives to it. No one chose the admin box for that test. It simply turned out to be where the test arrived. If you served in the 14th Army, or your father or your grandfather did, in an infantry battalion, on the guns, in the workshops, or in the air crews that flew the supply runs, their names deserve to be kept alive. The comments beneath this video are as good a place as any to keep them. These men called themselves the Forgotten Army, half in bitterness and half in pride, because they felt the war in Europe had swallowed all the attention. Every name set down here is a small refusal to let that be the last word. By the opening of 1944, Slim was ready to go back into the Arakan and lay the ghost of the first campaign to rest. The task fell to the 15th Corps under Lieutenant General Philip Christison, and its plan was methodical rather than dashing. 2 Indian divisions would advance side by side down the Mayu Peninsula. On the coastal flank went the 5th Indian Division. On the inland flank, in the valley of the Kalapanzin River, went the 7th Indian Division under Major General Frank Messervy. Messervy was a cavalryman by trade, lean, quick, and aggressive, and he had already pulled off one extraordinary escape earlier in the war. Captured in the Western Desert in 1942, he had stripped off his badges of rank, passed himself off as a harmless old orderly, and slipped away from his captors. He was not a man who frightened easily, and in the days ahead that would matter a great deal. There was more to the 15th Corps than those 2 forward divisions. Far to the east in the parallel valley of the Caledon River, the 81st West African Division was fighting its way south through country so wild that it had no usable road behind it at all. Prasse. Those men, drawn from Britain's colonies in West Africa, were already being supplied entirely from the air, carried forward along an invisible line of aircraft rather than a visible line of lorries. In a sense, they were a quiet rehearsal for the ordeal, about to be forced on the garrison at Sinzweya, proof in advance that a whole formation could live and fight with no road behind it, so long as the aircraft kept coming. Behind the fighting divisions lay reserves as well. Among them the 26th Indian Division, held ready to be fed into the battle the moment it turned truly serious. Christison had spent the quiet months building a corps designed to soak up a heavy blow without coming apart, with depth behind it, and air supply woven all through it. What he could not know until the enemy actually struck was whether he had built it well enough to survive what the Japanese were about to do to it. Between the 2 divisions rose the Mayu Range, and the only decent crossing in that sector was a track that British engineers had bulldozed into a road over a pass. On the map, it was the Ngakyedauk Pass. No British soldier could get his tongue around that, so they christened it the Ngakyedauk Pass, and the name stuck fast. Along the Ngakyedauk flowed everything the 7th Division needed to live and to fight. And at the eastern foot of the pass, in a flat clearing near a village called Sinzweya, the division set down its beating heart. The administrative area. The place where the supplies were stacked, the lorries parked, the wounded treated, the guns repaired. The soldiers called it the admin box. It measured only about 1,200 yards across, a patch of open paddy and low scrub with a single stubby hillock in the middle that everyone knew as Ammunition Hill, because that was where the shells were piled. On almost every side it was overlooked by jungle-covered high ground. In the language of the manuals, it was frankly indefensible. It had been laid out for convenience, not for a siege, because no one imagined it would ever become the centre of a battle. It was the softest and most exposed spot in the whole division, which is precisely why the Japanese steered straight for it. For the Japanese were coming. In the first days of February 1944, they launched an offensive of their own in the Arakan, and it carried a name, Operation Ha-Go. It was run by the 55th Division under Lieutenant General Tadashi Hanaya, beneath the wider authority of the 28th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai. Here we have to stop on a detail that trips up almost every retelling of this battle, because there were two senior officers named Sakurai, and they were not related to one another. Shozo Sakurai commanded the army. The infantry striking force that actually did the infiltrating was led by a different man entirely, Major General Tokutaro Sakurai. It is a small thing, but this is a story that stands or falls on getting such things right. Right. The army-level Sakurai gave the orders. The other Sakurai, Tokutaro, led the men through the jungle. Ha-Go had two purposes, and the second mattered far more than the first. On the surface, it was meant to smash the 15th Corps in the Arakan. Underneath, it was an enormous feint. The Japanese were on the very edge of launching their main offensive of the year. Far to the north, the great thrust at Imphal and Kohima that they hoped would carry them onto the plains of India itself. The Arakan attack was designed to look so dangerous that the British would rush their reserves southward to deal with it, stripping the northern front just before the real blow landed. To sell the feint, the Arakan attack had to be sudden, and it had to be ferocious. Hanaya's men were told to destroy the 7th Indian Division within 10 days. And here the Japanese plan carried inside it the very assumption we met before, now sharpened into a hard fact of supply. The infiltrating columns travelled light. They carried very little food, because the plan did not require them to carry much. They were expected to seize what they needed from the British as they overran the rear. The Japanese soldiers even had a sardonic name for the enemy stores they meant to capture. They called them Churchill rations. The whole timetable of Ha-Go, the entire 10-day clock, was wound on the certainty that they would be eating British food within a few days of setting out. That certainty was the flaw in the foundation. The crack ran directly beneath the admin box. If the box held, if its stacked rations and ammunition were never taken, then the men attacking it would not merely be checked. They would starve at the very gate of the thing that could have saved them. The blow aimed at the box was the core of Ha-Go, but it was very far from the whole of it. To sow confusion and to freeze the British in place, the offensive flung out other columns across a wide front. One force crossed the Mayu Range at a place the defenders had written off as impassable and came down behind the 5th Indian Division on the coastal side, cutting the road that fed it and turning the sea flank into a battle of its own. Another pressed against the strong fortified belt further south, around the village of Razabil and the two disused railway tunnels on the road from Mongdor to Buthidaung, holding the British hard against those positions so that they could not turn and march to the rescue of the surrounded division inland. It was the old method written large across the whole peninsula: get behind the enemy in several places at once, sever every line that carried his food and his ammunition, then wait for the fear, to do the work that bullets alone could not. Every part of it was sound, and every part of it rested on the same buried assumption that a cut-off British force was a doomed one. Strip that assumption away, and the whole elaborate scheme became a scattering of columns wandering ever deeper into country they had no way to feed themselves in. In the small hours of the 4th of February 1944, the trap was sprung. Under cover of night and river mist, Tokutaro Sakurai's force crossed the Kalapansin and swung north around the flank of the 7th Division, exactly as the doctrine prescribed. They moved fast through ground the British had dismissed as too rough to matter, and they took the village of Town Bazaar, well behind the divisional front. Then they turned south and drove down into the division's rear, with Colonel Tanahashi's regiment at the point heading straight for the pass and the bog that lay behind it. Within 2 days the Japanese were where they always aimed to be, behind everything. On the 6th and 7th of February, they fell upon the headquarters of the 7th Indian Division itself. This was the nerve centre, the place from which Messervy ran his brigades, and now it was suddenly full of Japanese infantry in the dark. Staff officers and signallers fought with pistols and rifles among the tents. Clerks burned their maps and their code books. Out on the divisional radio net, operators listening miles away heard the ordinary chatter of a headquarters cut off in mid-sentence. Then a single calm voice telling someone to put a pick through the wireless set, and then nothing at all. The headquarters of an entire division had been overrun. By every rule the Japanese had ever proved on a battlefield, this was the moment the 7th Division should have shattered. It did not, and the reason it did not begins with what Frank Messervy did next. He neither surrendered nor tried to flee back over the pass to India. He gathered the men around him, split them into small parties, and led them out on foot through the jungle by night, toward the one place he was sure could still hold, the admin box. He reached Sinzweya, filthy and without most of his staff, and there he set up a fresh command post, using a radio borrowed from a tank regiment. A general, who by the enemy's script should by now have been dead, or a prisoner, was instead standing in the middle of his own supply dump, back in control of his division. But he made one decision that mattered enormously. He would fight the wider battle of the whole division from there and hand the close-in defence of the box itself to another man. That man was Brigadier Geoffrey Evans. Evans had only just taken over a brigade in the neighbouring 5th Division when he was flung into the fire with a single flat order from Christison: reach the box, take command of it, and hold it to the last. He arrived to find a nightmare of a military problem waiting for him. He had a perimeter thousands of yards around, overlooked by high ground, the enemy already sat on, and the great majority of the men inside had never been trained to fight as infantry at all. They were storekeepers and lorry drivers, cooks and clerks, medical orderlies and mule leaders. Many were non-combatant Indian ancillaries whose whole purpose had always been to keep the machine of a division turning over behind the fighting, not to crouch in a trench and kill. One of his battalion commanders described the raw material without flinching. The most that could be asked of most of these men, he said, was to hold a static line. They were untried in battle and untrained in almost everything beyond firing out of a hole in the ground. So Evans did the only thing that could be done. He turned the entire population of the box into a garrison. Every man who could hold a rifle was given a place in the line and told in effect that his job had become very simple. Stay where you are put. Keep the Japanese out. And into this improvised fortress he drew the handful of real fighting units he could lay his hands on, and they are worth naming because they carried the battle. There was the infantry of the 2nd Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment. There were the guns, mountain artillery and medium and heavy pieces, around 20 of them, dug in on and about Ammunition Hill so they could fire outward in every direction of the compass. There were Gurkhas of the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, and there were, more precious than any of them, the tanks. The tanks belonged to the 25th Dragoons. They were American-built medium tanks of the type the British called Lee and Grant. In the deserts of North Africa, these machines had already been judged second-rate, tall, ungainly, with their main gun mounted low in the hull rather than in a proper turret. But in the close country of the Arakan, they were transformed into something close to decisive, because the Japanese here had almost no tanks of their own and no effective means of killing one. The Grant carried a 75mm gun in its hull to throw high explosive, and a 37mm gun in its turret that could fire canister, a giant shotgun cartridge that cut down infantry in the open like standing corn. A single troop of these tanks grinding across to a threatened stretch of the wire and firing point blank into the charging waves could break an assault that would have swamped infantry left to fight alone. Evans understood exactly what he had been handed. He held the tanks and his best infantry back as a mobile fist, ready to strike out at whatever the enemy threw at him, rather than scattering them thinly around the perimeter where their power would leak away. There was something about the makeup of that garrison that is easy to pass over, worth pausing on. The men crammed into the box were not a single regiment or a single people. They were British and Indian and Gurkha, Hindu and Muslim and Sikh and Christian, riflemen and gunners and tank crews standing shoulder to shoulder with clerks and cooks and mule drivers who had never expected to fire a shot in anger. They spoke different languages, prayed to different gods, and ate different food. And for the better part of 3 weeks, they held the same square of paddy together against everything the enemy could bring to bear. This was the real texture of the 14th Army, a force raised across half the world and bound together, not by blood or nation, but by a shared refusal to be pushed one step further. The Japanese plan had quietly counted on a mixture like that, coming apart under strain, each part looking only to its own survival. Instead, it held fast, and the holding of it was as much a victory of that strange, sprawling comradeship as it was of any tank or any gun. Now step back from the wire for a moment, because a larger question sits underneath this scene, and it is the opening question turned inside out. We asked why the surrounded British force did not run, but behind it lurks a deeper one. Why was this army, the beaten army of 1942, suddenly capable of an answer its enemy could not even picture? The answer is not that the British soldier was braver than the Japanese soldier, because man for man the Japanese infantry at the box fought with a courage that appalled the men facing them. The answer is structural. It is about two very different kinds of military machine and the different ways in which each could and could not change. The Japanese army that had swept across Southeast Asia was, in a real sense, the prisoner of its own success. Its doctrine of infiltration and encirclement had worked so completely, so many times over, that it had set into something close to Holy Writ. The plan for Hago did not merely use that doctrine, it staked everything on it, right down to the food in the soldiers' packs. There was no serious thought given to what should be done if the enemy simply stayed put and declined to starve, because within the Japanese frame of mind, that was not a thing that enemies did. The system was brilliant, iron, disciplined, and ferociously brave, and it was also brittle, because it had stopped asking whether the world it had been built to fight in still existed. The army Slim had rebuilt was, by contrast, an army that had been beaten badly enough to grow, willing to question everything it once assumed. Defeat is a cruel teacher, but it is a thorough one. Because the 14th Army had lost, and lost heavily, it was ready to throw out the oldest instinct in land warfare, the horror of being cut off, and to swap it for something that leaned on aircraft radios and a promise from the sky. It could make that leap partly because it had allies with vast industrial and air power behind it, the transport squadrons of the Royal Air Force and of the United States Army Air Forces. But sheer resources explain nothing on their own, because the aircraft counted for little without the willingness to reorganize a whole way of fighting around them, to trust a clerk with a rifle and a division with a parachute. The Japanese had discipline, doctrine, and pride in abundance. What the British had painfully rediscovered in the ashes of 2 defeats was flexibility. And in this battle, at this moment, flexibility proved the deadlier weapon of the two. If your family kept letters, photographs, or a service record from the Burma Campaign, from the Arakan, from the transport squadrons, or from any of the Indian, African and British units of the 14th Army, do not let them slide into a drawer and be forgotten. Think about giving a copy to a regimental archive or a local museum. It is one of the very few ways a story like this outlives the people who lived it. Now, back to Sinzweya, where the promise from the sky was about to be tested in the harshest possible way. Cut off on the 7th of February, in order to hold the box could only survive if it could be fed and reamed from the air, and the very first drops ran straight into catastrophe. The Japanese still had fighters over the Arakan in those opening days, and when the slow transport aircraft lumbered in low across the perimeter, the fighters were waiting for them. Some of the transports were driven off. The entire theory, the whole promise that a surrounded force could be kept alive from above, teetered on the brink of collapse in its first hours for the plainest of reasons. You cannot drop supplies out of an aircraft that is being shot down. Everything now hung on winning the sky over the box, and that fight was being settled by a machine that had only lately reached the theatre. The Supermarine Spitfire. Squadrons of Spitfires flying from newly cut airfields around Chittagong climbed to sweep the skies over the Arakan, and in a run of sharp actions through February, they broke the back of Japanese air power in that corner of the front. Once the fighters overhead were British, the transports could work in earnest, and work they did day after day. The Dakotas came up from India, throttled back over the perimeter, and pushed load after load out into the air. Rations, water, medicine. Above all, ammunition, to feed the endless hunger of the guns on Ammunition Hill. When the fighters had first driven the transports away, the American officer commanding the air transport effort, Brigadier General William Auld, is said to have personally led the aircraft back over the box to get the loads down. Munitions and days of food for tens of thousands of men had been stockpiled at the Indian airfields beforehand, precisely against a siege like this one. The whole burden of keeping the box alive fell on the transport crews, and it asked a very great deal of them. The Dakota was a converted airliner, without armour and without guns, and to lay its loads onto so small a target, it had to fly in low and slow and dead straight, which is exactly the flight path a gunner on the ground prays for. The crews flew that run over the perimeter, again and again in spite of it, because they understood the plain arithmetic of what they were doing. Every load that drifted wide of the wire was a gift to the starving enemy in the trees. Every load that fell true was one more day the garrison could hold. Some of the stores came down swinging under parachutes. The tougher items were simply pushed out of the doors to free fall into the paddy, to be dragged into cover while the fire came down around them. It was unglamorous, dangerous, repetitive work, flown by men whose names are almost never spoken when this battle is remembered, and without it there would have been no battle to remember, only one more surrender in the jungle. The parachutes drifted down inside a perimeter so tight that both sides sometimes sprinted for the same fallen bundle. Across the roughly 5 weeks of the wider Arakan battle, the transport crews flew about 714 sorties into the surrounded divisions of the 15th Corps, delivering on the order of 2,300 tons of supplies. More than 1,600 tons of that came down into the admin box alone. Sit with those numbers and grasp what they meant on the ground. They meant that the one thing the whole Japanese plan had been built to accomplish, the slow strangulation of a cut-off enemy, was simply not taking place. The men in the box were being fed along a supply line the Japanese could neither see nor sever because it ran through the air above their heads. But feeding a garrison is not the same as saving it, and the fighting in and around the box during those weeks was as savage as anything British and Indian soldiers endured in the entire war. The tanks and the massed guns quickly taught the Japanese that daylight assaults across the open paddy were suicidal, so they came at night instead. Night after night after night, they came silently through the scrub, and then, all at once, with the shriek of a bayonet charge. They called out in English, and in Urdu, in the darkness, pretending to be friendly troops trying to lure the defenders out of their pits or make them hold their fire a fatal second too long. They got in among the positions and were thrown out at close quarters, and came on again. For the storemen and the clerks in the perimeter, men who a month earlier had been counting boxes and stamping forms, it was a nightly ordeal of terror and exhaustion, and the remarkable thing, the thing that decided the battle, is how few of them broke and ran. The conditions alone would have broken many trained soldiers. The box was a small space crammed with men, guns, vehicles, and the dead under a hot sun, thick with flies and the stench of a battlefield that could not be cleared. Water was rationed and had to be dropped in like everything else. And still the guns fired, over open sights, out into the tree line. The heavy anti-aircraft gunners of an Ulster regiment brought their 3.7-inch guns down flat and fired them across the paddy in the ground roll, straight into the Japanese as they formed up. The medium gunners dropped 5.5-inch shells on targets as close as 400 yards, terrifyingly near their own line. There is a story from those days that catches the strange, dogged humour of the place. Asked over the radio how his position was holding out, one gunner is supposed to have answered that all was fine, but could they please drop him 100 bayonets? The commanding officer of the tank regiment, a man named Frink, called it one of the bitterest actions of modern times, and reckoned it in some ways worse even than Dunkirk, because of the way the enemy could crawl up close under cover of the jungle before he struck. Early in the siege, the Japanese aimed a blow at the one target that ought, by any ordinary reckoning, to have broken a garrison's spirit. On the night of the 7th to the 8th of February, a party of Japanese infantry overran the main dressing station, the field hospital at the heart of the box, held by only a handful of men and full of wounded who could not move. What happened there was not a battle, it was a massacre, and it has to be told plainly, without lingering over the horror for its own sake. The Japanese killed the helpless. They murdered patients where they lay on their stretchers. They seized the doctors, forced them to hand over drugs, and then killed them as well. Around 35 men, medical staff and patients together, were murdered in that place. Others were led away and shot. One Indian medical officer, a lieutenant named Basu, lived only by lying still among the dead and smearing himself with another man's blood, and he stayed hidden for days before he could reach safety. When Evans sent tanks and infantry to retake the dressing station the next morning, they found almost no one left alive. It is worth pausing on what an atrocity of that kind actually does, because the men who ordered it expected it to spread fear, and it achieved the reverse. The killings at the dressing station did not frighten the garrison into folding. They enraged it. From that point on, the men in the box stopped thinking of the enemy in the trees as an opponent to be resisted and began to think of him as something to be wiped out, and the fighting took on a pitiless quality on both sides. The one thing the massacre entirely failed to do was make a single defender want to give up the box. If anything, it welded the men to their ground. The true prize, inside the perimeter, was Ammunition Hill, the low rise where the shells were stored and the guns were dug in, and the Japanese understood its value perfectly. If they could take that hill and the ammunition heaped around it, they could silence the guns and feed their own starving offensive in one stroke. On the 9th of February, their mountain guns found the dumps, set them ablaze, and for a time the middle of the box was a roaring inferno of cooking off shells, a sight that from the surrounding hills must have looked like the death of the whole position. It was not. Infantry and tanks counterattacked and retook the ground, and the guns went on firing, and on the body of a Japanese officer killed in that fighting, the defenders found something beyond price. A marked map, laying out the entire scheme of the enemy attack. Slim later noted with grim thanks that the Japanese habit of carrying detailed orders and marked maps into battle had handed his men an almost complete picture of the plan against them. The defenders were no longer fighting blind. The heaviest effort came in the middle of February, when Tanahashi threw his strength at the perimeter in an all-out attack meant to finish the thing at last. A feature the defenders called C Company Hill was lost in the fury of it and retaken the following day. Still the box held. Each dawn the garrison found itself smaller, filthier, and more exhausted, and still holding the same ground it had held the dawn before. That, not any single dramatic charge, was the real victory. Every day the box did not fall was a day the Japanese timetable slid further into ruin. Out beyond the perimeter, the battle to break through to the box had begun. The Japanese roadblocks jammed into the Ngakyedauk Pass had to be smashed from the outside, and that grim task fell chiefly to the 5th Indian Division, fighting eastward over the mountains to reach the men they could hear battling in the valley beyond. The mountain fighting was a hell of its own, a slow grind of bunkers and ridgelines paid for a yard at a time, and it produced the single act of valour from this battle to be marked with the highest award for gallantry the British could give. On the 16th of February, near the Ngakyedauk Pass, Major Charles Hoey of the Lincolnshire Regiment led his company against a vital Japanese strong point. Hoey was a Canadian, born in British Columbia, serving in an English county regiment far from home. Already hit in the leg and the head, and bleeding, he snatched a light machine gun from one of his men and, firing it from the hip as he ran, charged the position at the head of his company. He reached the enemy bunker first, ahead of every other man, and killed its occupants, and he was mortally wounded in the doing of it. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, and it was the only one of the battle. Day by day the pressure told, but it told against the attackers, not the defenders. And this is the exact reversal the whole story has been climbing toward. The Japanese around the box were now the ones who were starving. They had bet everything on seizing the supplies inside the perimeter within a few days. The supplies had never been seized, and the perimeter had never fallen, and now the invisible river of stores from the sky was pouring strength into the defenders while the men in the encircling jungle chewed on nothing. The 10-day clock had run out long before. Tanahashi's regiment, better than 2,000 strong at the outset, had been worn down toward a few hundred men still able to fight. His soldiers were dying now, not only from British shells and canister, but from plain hunger. The encirclers had become the besieged. The hunters were caged in the jungle with nothing to eat, pinned there by a doctrine that offered them no instructions at all for a situation it had never imagined could occur. On the 21st of February, the relieving troops fought their way through the last serious Japanese block in the pass. The final bunker, on a height known only by its map number, .1070, was broken open when a single medium gun was manhandled into place and fired some 20 rounds into it at short range. Within a day the pass was clear, and infantry of the King's Own Scottish borderers pushing out from the box met a squadron of the 25th Dragoons coming the other way, and the ring around the admin box was broken. The men fighting in from outside found a garrison, hollow-eyed and unshaven, ringed by its own dead and the enemy's, but unbroken, and still holding every yard it had been told to hold. The siege had lasted somewhere around 18 days. It was in the last stage of that collapse that Colonel Tanahashi, out of food, out of hope, and out of any order that still made sense, took the decision we began with. He ordered his surviving men to pull back on his own authority, without leave from above, because to stay was now only to die for nothing. His divisional commander, Hanea, formally called off Operation Hago a few days later. The great feint had failed both as a feint and as an attack. It had neither destroyed the 7th Indian Division nor drawn the British reserves fatally out of position for the far larger battle now gathering in the north. It is worth being clear about what the great feint actually achieved, because it turned out to be almost the exact reverse of what its authors intended. Go had been meant to frighten the British into rushing their reserves south, so that the northern front would stand bare when the main offensive fell. For a short while it did pull troops and attention southward. But because the Arakan battle was won, and won quickly enough, the very divisions the Japanese had hoped to pin down or destroy were instead set loose, rested resupplied, and carrying a hard new confidence. The 5th and 7th Indian Divisions became a reserve that could be thrown wherever the crisis was sharpest. Lieutenant General Hanaya had driven the attacks on the box with what Slim dryly called a dull ferocity, feeding men into the guns long after any hope of a quick decision had gone. In doing so, he did not merely fail to take the box. He spent an entire offensive to no purpose, and he handed the British both the confidence and the seasoned troops they would need for the far greater trial waiting for them in the north. The scale of the Japanese defeat is worth stating exactly, because it is the measure of how completely the doctrine had broken. Of roughly 8,000 Japanese troops committed to the offensive, barely 3,000 came out of it. Something like 5,000 were dead. Tanahashi's regiment, better than 2,100 at the start, could muster around 400 at the finish. On the British and Indian side, the 15th Corps as a whole lost about 3,500 men killed, wounded and missing, and only a portion of those losses were fatal. For once, and for the first time in this theatre, it was the Japanese who had been bled white and the British and Indians who held the field at the end. Nor did the victory stop at the rim of the box. With the siege broken and the enemy streaming back into the hills, the 15th Corps did not pause to admire what it had done. It turned and took up again the very advance that Hargo had been designed to wreck. Over the following weeks, the British and Indian battalions closed in on the fortified positions the Japanese had clung to for so long, the dug-in strong point at Razabil and the twin railway tunnels on the road between Mongdo and Buthidong, and by the start of May 1944, those hard-won objectives had fallen as well. The offensive that Japan had launched to annihilate the 15th Corps ended by clearing the path for that same corps to take the ground it had set out for in the first place. Seldom in the whole war did an attack rebound so completely upon the men who ordered it. So we come back at last to the question we started with. Why did they not run? The answer is not one thing, but a chain of things, and each link in it was forged by a different set of hands. They did not run in the first place because they no longer had to. The oldest reason for a surrounded army to break is that a surrounded army cannot eat, and that reason had been quietly abolished in the mind of a blunt-spoken general who decided the sky itself could be a road. Air supply is the thing everyone remembers about the admin box, and rightly so, because it changed the whole arithmetic of the campaign. Yet air supply, on its own, would only have delayed a slaughter. It bought the garrison time, nothing more. Something still had to be done with that time. They did not run, secondly, because they were handed the means to make standing still survivable. The clumsy tanks that turned lethal in the jungle, the guns firing outward over open sights from the hill at the centre, the few veteran battalions kept back as a striking reserve rather than smeared around the wire. These were the tools that let a garrison of clerks and cooks actually stop the assaults that air supply had given them the chance to face. Courage without the canister rounds would not have been enough. Neither would the canister rounds without the courage, and they did not run. Thirdly, and most importantly of all, because somebody had first rebuilt them into men who believed they did not have to. This is the least tangible link in the chain, and it is the deepest. An army that a year before had run from this same jungle now sat down in it and stayed, while its own headquarters burned, and its hospital was butchered, and the enemy called to it out of the dark, and it held. That did not come about by accident. It came about because a beaten army had spent long months being taught, in 100 small and unglamorous ways, that the Japanese soldier was only a man and could be killed, that the jungle was ground that could be held, and that the promise of supply from the air was a promise that would be kept when it counted. The box was where all of that teaching was put on trial in front of the whole army, and where it came back proven true. It would be wrong to gild this in glory and leave it there, because the cost was real, and a great deal of it was paid by people who had no say in any of it. The murdered wounded in the dressing station were helpless men killed in their beds. The Indian ancillaries who held long stretches of that perimeter were, many of them, men who had signed on to drive lorries and mend engines, not to die under a bayonet charge in the dark, and some of them died anyway. The Japanese dead in the surrounding jungle, 5,000 of them, were the victims not only of British guns, but of a high command and a doctrine that flung them at an enemy who declined to be eaten and then left them no way out when the plan came apart. There is nothing clean about any of it. What can be said is that the men who held the box, from the West Yorkshire riflemen to the cooks turned sentries, did a thing that had been declared impossible, and that in the doing of it they broke a spell that had hung over the whole Eastern War. A word about how this account was put together, because it matters. Every person named in it was real. Every unit, every date, every figure is drawn from the records left by the men who fought and the historians who have studied the battle since. There are no invented characters here, and no composite ones standing in for several real people. Where the story opens on Colonel Tanahashi giving his order in the last days of the fighting, it keeps to what the record supports. His shattered regiment was real. His shortage of food and ammunition was real. His unauthorized withdrawal was real, and the message he sent, regretting it, but insisting there was no alternative, survives in his own words. What no document can hand us is the private feeling of any one man in that jungle, and that has not been invented to fill the gap. The general who made the victory possible had the last and clearest word on what it meant. William Slim judged that the Arakan battle, small though it was beside the vast clashes of the war, was one of the historic successes of British arms, precisely because of what it did to the mind of his army. It was, he wrote, the first time a British force had met the full weight of a major Japanese offensive, held it, broken it, and driven it back in pieces. And its effect, he believed, ran far beyond the men who actually fought it, because it killed at last the legend of Japanese invincibility in the jungle. That is why the admin box matters out of all proportion to its size. What was proved at Sinzweya in February 1944 was carried north within weeks and used again on a scale 100 times greater. When the main Japanese offensive crashed onto Imphal and Kohima that spring, the British and Indian defenders did there precisely what the garrison of the box had done. They let themselves be surrounded, they formed their defended boxes. They held, and they were fed from the air, and this time it was whole divisions doing it, among them the very formations that had first learned the lesson down in the Arakan. Several of them lifted north to the new battle by the same kind of transport aircraft that had saved them. The Japanese, still faithful to the doctrine that had just failed them in the south, cut the roads and settled down to wait for the collapse that Sinzweya had already shown would never come. Instead, their army starved before Kohima and Imphal, in the greatest defeat their army had suffered on land in the whole war. Up to that point, there is a bitter final irony in it. While the box still held, Japanese radio had announced to the world that a British army in the Arakan had been destroyed, and that the march on Delhi had begun. The army in question was not destroyed. It had been fed from the sky, and it had held. And within a matter of weeks its divisions were flying north to help break the enemy, who had declared them finished. It all traces back to a clearing full of clerks and cooks who were told to stay where they were, and stayed. The men who held that ground were not supermen, and most of them never expected to be remembered at all. They belonged to the army that named itself, with the bleak humour of soldiers who felt overlooked, the forgotten army. The least that can be done all these years on is to decline to forget them.